us your unbelievable inputs into the future. Just before we start, Tracy's going to put up a poll. Ort receives donations and uses that to bring you fantastic talks like this. So, Tracy, if you want to put up the poll, people can select what donations they want to give from the poll. You can select one of those chosen amounts or any of the others. Great, thank you. So, as I introduced Arthur for part one of the talk, Trends That Are Shaping Business and Society Today, I mentioned that Arthur speaks at a number of different places, is renowned for his speaking. He's an international award-winning writer, an analyst, a commentator. His Worldwide Works company does a lot of research revealing these fantastic trends. But since I spoke to you last time, we've got some breaking news for you. And the breaking news is that Arthur has been inducted into the Professional Speakers Association of South Africa Hall of Fame. So I think, Arthur, you deserve a huge round of applause for that.
Thank you.
You can hear the crowd going mad in the background. But I think if anybody is ever inducted into any Hall of Fame, I think it's an unbelievable achievement. So really, I know this is, you receive it on one day, but it's lots and lots of work, and it's stuff that you love, and that's why you're so good at it. So I think it's an absolute privilege to have you here today. And I'm glad that your talk last week inspired them to give you this prize this week.
Thank you, Dave.
As I mentioned last time, Arthur is the author, and it maybe the name like led him to that. Arthur is now an author of 19 books. It's incredible. Most people, they say everyone's got a book in them. Arthur's obviously got a lot more than that. And just with your talk today, I came across this quote that I thought was quite apt, which is, if you don't think about the future, you cannot have one. And Arthur is allowing us and helping us to think about that future and revealing that light at the end of the tunnel. So Arthur, over to you, and I look forward to you sharing that light at the end of the tunnel with us.
Thank you, David. Part of the idea of today's presentation is to ensure that you don't get blinded by that light at the end of the tunnel. So last week we spoke about the shape of the future on the basis of what we can learn from the past. And it gave us an insight into how the future was shaped over the last century and a bit, and also the impact of technologies that emerged over the years, but also attitudes that emerged over the years. And we also talked about those technologies that haven't broken through and the reasons for that. And we concluded on the beginnings of the end of various industries, such as physical recorded music, printed magazines, and the like. So the question that we ended with was, which industry is next, and which are the careers of tomorrow, and which are not the careers of tomorrow? So this is the first career that you should not prepare yourself for. Now, it's not an accountant, it's a bookkeeper. The bookkeeper, as we know it, is history. And the reason for that is that there are now so many tools that do the work of the bookkeeper and so much more, that the basic bookkeeper really is already history. And I'll show you one example of a company that has completely disrupted the concept of bookkeeping. And that is Xero, X-E-R-O. And this is the app marketplace. The very fact that one company in one sector has an entire marketplace of apps equivalent to on your cell phone, having apps that transform your ability to use that device to communicate with people, means that in an industry sector or a career choice like bookkeeping, you have the same facility. So in the same way that with a current smartphone, you no longer need a gaming device, you no longer need a camera, you don't need a GPS device for navigation in your car. Same with in Bookkeeper, you don't need someone to conduct numerous activities that can now all be done automatically through an app that's linked to your online accounting service. Xero is just one example. Eventually, all online accounting will be based on being able to import the functionality you need for any purpose. So this was just searching in the app marketplace for accounts. And this was just the first page of the accounts options. Look down the left-hand side and look at all the categories of functions that you can do a search on. So just on bills and expenses, on CRM, on conversions. So I clicked on e-commerce, and this is, for example, what came up just within e-commerce, all the different options and functionalities from point of sale to shopping carts and creating a more attractive store for an e-commerce presence. Almost anything to do with making money and tracking your money and your business is built in to the app marketplace. When you have an entire marketplace of functionality of this kind at very low cost and sometimes no cost, why would you hire someone or a team of people to do this? Of course, you might do that because you can't get your head around the functionality, but then you would be hiring someone who understands how to use these tools, not someone who understands only how a ledger works, for example. Then by the middle of this decade, we're probably going to see the final departure of bank branches. What you'll have is bank offices and bank head offices, perhaps. And there might be service centers where you might need to pop in to speak to a human being. But just look at that building. It's Barclays Bank, one of the most legendary and solid banks the world has ever known. But that structure, that edifice, in fact, represents exactly why the bank branch is going to go away, for two reasons. One is that anyone who traditionally would have gone into the bank to do their banking is now doing it on their phone. Their bank is in their phone. And the second factor is the massive cost of maintaining that infrastructure. So Barclays, ABSA, FNB still have massive physical infrastructure. But along come the challenger banks. And I'm not talking about Discovery, which also has a massive infrastructure that it has to support. I'm talking about banks that don't have any infrastructure. Have a look at the cost structure of one of these banks. This is Bank Zero. Look at the cost of every functionality that you normally pay for in any other bank. I don't have to spell out what it all adds up to. That's Bank Zero, which promises zero banking fees for standard banking services. The moment you start interacting with other banks where there are fees involved, that's where fees start coming through to you. But they are not having to charge you because they don't have the infrastructure. And they've also funded all their own development. They initially looked at whether they needed investment from venture capitalists and the like, and they realized that based on Michael Jordaan's existing resources, he could actually fund it himself. And by funding it himself, he also cut out all the costs that would have accrued to having venture capital, private equity, and the like. So it's not just a zero fees bank, but it's the almost zero cost bank. And this sums up why the bank branch is history. By 2030, we'll see these objects disappearing. The petrol filling station. And the reason is already fairly obvious. This represents the plans of all the major car manufacturers for conversion to electric vehicles. I know it's very small print, so I'll tell you what's in there. BMW expects to have the entire European market electrified in terms of car sales by 50% by 2030. Mazda says all models will be electric vehicles or hybrids by the early 2030s. Honda says 2/3 of global sales will be electric vehicles by 2030. VW Group, 70% of new electric models by 2028. Initially, they had projected 50% by then. Now they're projecting 70%. So already the future is arriving even faster than it did a couple of years ago. And then global sales, not new models, but global sales, 40% will be electric by 2030. And Daimler-Benz, electric vehicle will make up more than 50% of sales by 2030. So there is still room for the petrol station by 2030, but at least half the demand will have vanished by then. And this is expected to be the electric vehicle market share by major region by 2030. The top one, the lightish blue one, is China. 50% of its market is likely to be electric. The bottom one, the United States, is something like 30% or just below 30% expected to be electric. And then global share is the green bar, which is just above 30%. So around 1/3 of the global market is expected to be electric vehicles. And forgive the term, but from there on, it'll simply accelerate. This is what the electric vehicle charging forecourt now looks like, or at least the standard one. This is in Essex in the United Kingdom, all electric charging points. What's really interesting about this picture is that it looks no different to a regular filling station. Those could be petrol filling points instead of charging stations. But we can expect this picture to also shift significantly by 2030, because eventually everyone will be charging their cars in their homes, either overnight or when they simply need to recharge it, or they'll be charging at their offices. Electric charging stations will be almost as commonplace as electric plug points. And that's all you really ultimately need to charge an electric car. So why do you need even a forecourt for that? Then you've got to add up not just the electrification of vehicles, but also the connectivity of vehicles. This is Mercedes-Benz's vision for their onboard infotainment system, what they call MBUX, MBUX, and that's the Mercedes-Benz user experience. You can see how integrated this is. So all the information you need that you traditionally have on your dashboard, plus your route information, but this is route information on steroids. It highlights the extent of obstacles on the route, alternative routes, etc., all in a far easier picture than what you currently get on your little Waze screen or on the awful onboard navigation you have on most vehicles. And then if you're heading for some destination that's a tourist attraction, for example, it highlights information about that attraction that your passengers can then enjoy as well. So this is just the next step from the connected vehicle and the electric vehicle in the direction of the autonomous vehicle, because once you have self-driving vehicles, that steering wheel is going to become less of a factor, and the information on the performance of your vehicle or the speed or the distance will be spread across the infotainment system for whoever needs that information at any given time. And that means that by 2040, this picture will become truly anachronistic. People looking for spaces in a car park, that's going to disappear once cars can drive themselves. You might still have a picture that looks similar, which will be a staging point for vehicles as opposed to a car park for vehicles. And by staging point, I mean that when someone needs a vehicle, they'll call it on their smartphone, and the vehicle will leave the staging point and come collect you. But those staging points could also be distributed across an urban area and won't necessarily rely on one of these massive parking lots. This is the road towards that reality. This is a picture of the autonomous vehicle market that put together by Allied Market Research in their autonomous vehicle outlook. And they're saying by the middle of this decade, the autonomous vehicle market will reach more than $500 billion. It is growing at a compound annual growth rate of 39.5% from 2019 through to 2026. That's massive. And you can imagine if it's growing at that rate through to the middle of the decade, how much more it'll grow by the end of the decade. This shows you the current factors inhibiting that market. The purple diagram, or the purple overlay, is really an indicator of the barriers. And the biggest barriers are the growth of connected infrastructure and transition from ownership to mobility as a service on the one side, and on the other side, the high manufacturing cost with government regulations and safety issues also being factors. But as we go through this decade, what we'll discover is, or what we'll rather find, is a massive uptake as a result of supportive government regulations becoming a contributing factor rather than an inhibiting factor, and improved safety and reduction in traffic congestion becoming major supportive factors, growth factors, rather than inhibiting factors. And all of that, both the electrification and the autonomy, will then add up to a new picture of car ownership. So to explain what's happening here, in 2015, there were 87 million cars sold. By 2030, that's likely to reach 115 million, but it would have been a lot higher. That 87 million plus 41 million new car sales per year as a result of urbanization and economic growth and a rising middle class will be offset by 23 million fewer sales in terms of private ownership of vehicles. There'll be 23 million people who will have given up private ownership. And then in 2030, the market will have reached 115 million sales per year, of which 10 million will be shared vehicles. So that's almost 10% of the market in terms of sales will be shared vehicles. That will accelerate, again, no pun intended, through the 2030s. So by 2040, the idea of shared vehicles will be as commonplace, if not more commonplace, than the idea of private vehicles. And this also explains why that is going to be the case. Today, you use your vehicle for every purpose, from shopping to leisure to commuting. Whereas by 2030, you'll be using your phone to call a vehicle for each of those individual purposes, and you'll use a different kind of vehicle for each of those purposes. Commuting needs a different kind of vehicle to leisure, to business, and the likes. So what this doesn't even tell you is the extent to which mass transit, public transport, is also going to be transformed. And already today, the bus market is becoming primarily electric, but also increasingly autonomous. And on very specific routes, you are going to find that not just electric buses, but autonomous buses will be taking over the role of the traditional bus driver that we've had over the years. So already in Silicon Valley, there are certain routes that are completely autonomous. And within specific communities, gated communities, and controlled areas, you'll find that autonomy will become the dominant mode of transport. And then that will gradually expand beyond those areas. So this graph actually tells you the story of the autonomous vehicle over the next 2 decades. And what you see here are what you might call high road and low road scenarios based on regulatory challenges being overcome, the safety of the technology, and the enthusiasm of consumers. So if those all are met as conditions, then you'll find that by 2040, something like 90% of vehicles, new vehicle sales might be autonomous. And all new vehicle sales, even by 2035, are expected to have conditional or better autonomy than they have today. And if that sounds far-fetched, just think of the Tesla. The Teslas, by the middle of this decade, will all be capable of full autonomy. All of them have partial autonomy already built in, and they're the fastest growing car brand in the world. And when you look at it from that point of view, then you realize that this is not too far-fetched. There is a low road scenario for low disruption. So that was the high disruption picture. Low disruption is what we might well see in South Africa and many African countries, where technical and regulatory barriers delay commercial introduction, but also consumers perceive low value in autonomous vehicles. And the lowest uptake scenario suggests 10% full autonomy in these kind of countries by 2040, but conditional or improved autonomy will be 30% of new vehicles. So at minimum, 1 in 3 vehicles will have some form of autonomy by then, even in South Africa. But if the government gets its act together, if the economy grows, then it's going to be somewhere in between the low disruption and the high disruption scenario. Why this is so significant in terms of career choices is actually expressed by the rotating chair of Huawei, Eric Zhu. Just last Monday, 9 days ago, he made this statement. Once unmanned driving becomes a reality, we will see disruption in practically all adjacent sectors. It will trigger the most disruptive industry transformation the world will see in the next 10 years. And he's not talking about the automotive industry. He's talking about all adjacent industries. That references not just manufacture, but also component manufacture that supports adjacent industries, delivery, freight, logistics, tourism, almost any segment that you can think of that involves cars, transport infrastructure, roads, even the way cities are designed will be transformed by unmanned driving. And literally today, Huawei begins their journey to that future. So where Huawei had disrupted the cell phone market in the last decade, it intends to disrupt the vehicle market in the coming decade. And literally today, it unveiled its first electric vehicle in partnership with HBT. So it's not a Huawei branded vehicle, but it's a Huawei co-branded vehicle. And in a way, that's almost how they've also advanced in the world of smartphones, co-branding with the likes of, ironically, Porsche, as well as Leica and lens technology manufacturers and developers. So they see it as a partnership into the future. And that partnership is going to be a key part of the disruption of not just the automotive industry, but all adjacent industries. So the big question that emerges, of course, from all of this is which jobs will go as a result of this massive disruption of all industries, not just from Huawei, but from every manufacturer, every organization that is looking to embrace the future. And this, of course, is one of the key questions that face Auth Career Hub and that we want to address today. The other one is which jobs will come. Let's just first have a look at the factor behind which jobs will go. This is a company called CB Insights, which does an evaluation of new technologies, and this is their artificial intelligence top 100 list. I'm not going to go through the companies that they've listed, but the first point I want to make here is the very fact that they have a top 100 as opposed to a top 10 tells you that there are thousands of AI startups to choose from in this regard. The other key issue here is the range of applications and industries that are affected. Look at the top: healthcare, smart home, consumer devices, retail, media, supply chain and logistics. Just below that is finance, food, defense, legal, transportation. And then below that, categories of computing, data processing, and AI deployment. And one that really stands out for me is this one: NLP and conversational AI. NLP in this case doesn't stand for neuro-linguistic programming. It stands for natural language processing. Now, that is a clue and a key to the replacement of human beings by software, by artificial intelligence in any arena that requires someone to speak to someone else over the phone. If they can replace the knowledge by as databases of information and knowledge bases, and they can replace the interaction with artificial voice, those two are going to be put together to replace human beings. Now let's look at the extent of AI startup funding going on in Silicon Valley, but also globally. This is a sample of AI startups that are receiving venture capital funding. A company called Venture Scanner right now is tracking 3,384 AI startups. These are jointly attracting something like $128 billion in venture capital funding. That amount of startups, that amount of brain power going into these startups, and that amount of funding going into them tells you the extent to which almost every industry is facing massive disruption. This shows the categories of company receiving funding: computer vision platforms on the one side, smart robots in the middle, gesture control alongside that, down to the bottom where you have virtual assistants, recommendations, video recognition, and speech translation. It's astonishing the extent of AI functionality that is represented by this graph. So now I want to put up a poll, and I want to ask the question for you to answer in the poll. How many countries boast an AI startup industry? 31 countries, 51 countries, or 71 countries? In other words, where there is an emerging ecosystem of startups focused specifically on artificial intelligence. How many countries in the world would you say? Submit your questions. And those are the three options. What? Do we have an answer? Do we have the picture? I'm not seeing it on my side. So, and the answer is, so 58% said 31, a quarter said 51, and 17% said 71. So fewer than 1 in 5 of you have guessed that there are 71, and that's the correct answer. 71 countries have an AI startup industry, including South Africa. That tells you how global the artificial intelligence revolution already is. So without you realizing it, industries are already being transformed by artificial intelligence. And I'm showing you another chart of what they call the machine intelligence landscape. Machine intelligence is kind of the basic form of artificial intelligence. And almost any organization can download machine intelligence functionality off the cloud. Look at the second row: rethinking enterprise. Sales, security, authentication, fraud detection, HR, recruiting, marketing, personal assistance, intelligence tools. All of those are currently massive employers of human beings, and the need for human beings is going to vanish. And then the next row, rethinking industries. Entire massive industries which are going to be transformed, and that includes education, medical, automotive, and even oil and gas are going to be transformed by the ability to use artificial intelligence to automate processes. And I'll just show you the ones that involve direct human interaction, or just a sample of those: speech recognition, emotional recognition, even personal assistance, media and content, sales, massive disruption of people-hungry industries. So what does that mean? Where will we see the next big fall? And that picture gives you a clue of one of the areas where we're seeing a massive fall in employment. Not a week goes by that we don't see news of retrenchments from one or other traditional media body. But first, let's look at where the jobs currently are. So the biggest employers globally include not people who create impossible looking images of tourist attractions, but actually the people in that industry. So the biggest industry by employment in the world right now is tourism, 27 million. But we can expect that to have dropped quite significantly during the pandemic, but it'll also come back in a big way as people start traveling again. American Airlines just announced yesterday that they expect to reach 90% occupancy of their flights by the end of the year. And that is just the beginning. As vaccination becomes standard and becomes commonplace and most people are vaccinated, I believe that we'll see a massive comeback of tourism. Business travel will take a little longer because businesses have realized that it's far cheaper and sometimes far more effective to meet via Zoom than via airplane. And then consumer electronics manufacturing, fast food restaurants, commercial real estate, and clothes manufacturing. So those are the current big five. And that's where people will probably find jobs most easily, but they're not necessarily the best jobs. Fast food restaurants are seen as a starting job, but it's certainly a more sustainable starting job environment in call centers. Call center jobs will vanish in the coming few years. What's going to go big in 2021? The fast growing industries as we enter the second year of the pandemic. And number one is trucks. So I don't think you're going to see a massive clamor from your kids to join the trucking industry. But let's look at the big five. The five fastest growing industries and the proportion by which they'll grow this year. Heavy duty truck manufacturing, 29%. And that is because there's a massive pent up demand for delivery, for fulfillment, and therefore the whole logistics industry is going to benefit dramatically. And the second one is associated with that, water transportation, up 23%. And then casinos and online gambling, that's almost a reflection of what we spoke about last week, the roaring 20s coming back, people piling into areas where they can spend their money that they haven't been able to spend over the past year. Car and automobile sales up 16% as people get back on the road. And then oil and gas exploration and production up 15%. You've probably noticed that the oil prices made a massive recovery in the past few months, from being in the low $40 to being in the mid $60 per barrel. And that inspires huge growth in an industry. And these are the doomed five. The first one is almost obvious: respiratory ventilator manufacturing. There's now a global oversupply of ventilators as the infection rate for COVID-19 declines. In certain countries, there's still a massive shortage. So India and Brazil are in deep trouble. And some American states, those where they had the highest level of denialism around the pandemic, also facing a crisis. But otherwise, globally, the demand for manufacture is falling rapidly. And it's going to be more one of redistribution of the existing ventilators. They're not making new ones. That will be a big issue. Magazine publishing will actually fall. Cheese manufacturing is going to fall. So don't let your children go into cheese manufacturing. The reason for that however, is interesting. And that is because of the expectation that dairy consumption will fall because of people waking up to the health issues around consuming too much dairy. It's not that they'll stop drinking milk or eating cheese, but they'll reduce their consumption of it. And dairy-heavy diets will be changing as well. Computer hardware manufacturing is expected to fall this year, but there are manufacturers who will dispute that. Lenovo, for example, the world's #1 PC manufacturer, is experiencing growth at the moment because of the demand for home computers for people working remotely. And in newspaper publishing, also declining significantly, partly because some newspapers have just declined dramatically in quality in this country in particular. But generally speaking, that is a factor of people consuming more and more of their news online. So all areas that one must be cognizant of in terms of choosing a career. What does the next decade look like? Well, that image gives you a clue to what I'm going to be talking about. And what we're going to draw on here is projections from the US Department of Labor on what they expect in the coming decade. Although those are America-specific stats, they eventually filter through to the rest of the world as well. And these are the industries where they expect the biggest falls, the biggest declines in new jobs through to 2029. The one where new jobs will vanish completely is wired telecommunications carriers. In other words, if Telkom had stuck to their landlines, Telkom would be completely out of business by 2030. And same with any other pure wired telecoms carrier. So that actually explains why the likes of Telkom have had to become mobile service providers as well. I can't imagine any wired telecom service not becoming a mobile service. And then almost 100%, almost completely being decimated is the printed newspaper, magazine, book, and directory publishing industry. 1% will survive. The question is, which 1% will survive? And in printing and related support activities, following on from the one above, 82% decline, massive fall. There'll still be a need for printing. There'll still be a need for publishers, but far smaller than today. And then even as tourism remains a massive employer, travel reservation services and the travel agent is going to almost disappear. Not entirely, it's a 66% decline. So a third of the jobs will still be available. Again, the question is which third? And it'll be those people who can provide specialist services and who can provide niche services. But booking a flight, booking a holiday, that you're going to do online. You're going to do it on your cell phone. Your cell phone is your travel agent. And then cement and concrete product manufacturing is going to plummet by more than half. And that's not because people won't be building anymore. It's because building technology is advancing rapidly. And that means that new materials will be used for manufacture that'll be cheaper, lighter, and more environmentally friendly than cement and concrete. And then the big growth areas, and this is the one that everyone's obviously paying attention to. Where are the jobs going to come from, and the new jobs? And number one, individual and family services. Number three is home healthcare services. And number five is outpatient care centers. That word care, and that was why I chose that image of the adult hand holding the baby hand. It symbolizes the great need of the 2020s, and that will be personal care. Look at the number one line. 3.6 million people will be needed by 2029 that currently are not available in those segments. So social workers will be in massive demand. Family counseling will be in massive demand. All sectors involved with ensuring the well-being of individuals and families. So even though artificial intelligence and robots might replace some elements of surgery, they're certainly not going to replace medical care. And one of the questions that keeps coming up is whether doctors will be needed if people can diagnose themselves via their smartwatch, which can measure their oxygen supply, and it can measure their heart performance. Combine that with going to Dr. Google, who can tell you exactly what's wrong with you, and then you're going to take pills and you're going to die, because that's just stupid, allowing Google to be your doctor. So no, Google and your Fitbit won't replace your doctor. What it will do is make your doctor better and give your doctor better information on which to base a diagnosis, but more important, on which to base treatment. Number two is computer systems design and related services. So as expected, massive demand, 574% growth in jobs expected in that sector. And that includes developers, software designers, and the like. And then number four, management, scientific, and technical consulting services. So the consultant is going to have a boom time in the 2020s, but only if they have specialist skills. And there's specialist skills from both a management point of view and a technical point of view. So that MBA is going to remain valuable, but also the programmer who is also an analyst is going to be in great demand. Yes, I'm talking to you, Brian. That's Brian Turner, my data analyst, is in great demand at Worldwide Works. And then the next, also huge growth, but not as big, but they're all ones worth looking at. And they also spell out the extent to which it's not just one or two sectors where there will be job opportunities. Number two in the rest of the next is educational services, then couriers and messengers, because people will be conducting so much of their commercial activity online that the need for delivery services is going to increase dramatically. And that's why you see the share prices of companies like FedEx booming over the last year, as people became aware of just how strategic those services are. Support activities for mining, because natural resources are going to be needed for all of these sectors. Grant making and social advocacy organizations will be in great need. Administrative services, as much as AI will take over the drudge work and virtual assistants will take over a lot of the secretarial type work, administration of organizations is going to become critical. And then at the bottom, software publishers remain a massive growth area. I love this line from Elon Musk's company, a filing with the Securities Exchange Commission in the United States in the middle of March. This is all it said, effective as of March 15. The titles of Elon Musk and Zach Kirkhorn have changed to Techno King of Tesla and Master of Coin, respectively. However, they hedge their bets heavily. They will also maintain their respective positions of CEO and CFO. So it was really Elon Musk's joke on the SEC. They thought, why don't we call ourselves this? Or why don't we pretend we're calling ourselves this? So I don't think we're actually going to have a master of coin, but people will be very tempted to call themselves that. And one of the reasons is that cryptocurrency has exploded this year beyond all expectations. Bitcoin, as I said last week, worth between $50,000 and $70,000. And the new concept of ownership of products is the NFT, the non-fungible token, which is a crypto-based proof of ownership. While you shouldn't expect a rush for techno kings or coin masters, you are going to have people asking WTF when your WFH is disrupted by an NFT. WFH stands for work from home. NFT stands for non-fungible tokens. If you don't know what WTF stands for, ask your kids. But this image here is of an album by the Kings of Leon called When You See Yourself. And it's the first album in the world sold as an NFT. And what that meant is that to buy the album, you had to buy the non-fungible token of the album. And that was something you bought with cryptocurrency on an online exchange, which then gave you the rights to download the album. It gave you a unique version of the album art that you could also download. And you could then redeem the token to have a limited edition vinyl album sent to you. Yes, vinyl is still a thing, apparently. So that's, of course, very confusing to people who think of buying music as buying an album, whether it's vinyl, CD, or simply listening to it via Spotify. So why would you do this? Well, the reason is because it's a collectible. You're actually buying a collectible item, but instead of it being a physical item like a stamp or a comic book, which is my preferred collectible item, or a single malt whiskey, which is highly collectible if you buy the right ones, you're buying something digital. And we have seen in the last few weeks the massive revenues that are being generated by NFTs by people who are the first to market. I'm pleased to say that we've minted it's called minting when you create one. We've minted our own NFT at Gadget Magazine. It's called Gadget 1998. So if you want to bid for a unique NFT, it's up for auction at a site called rarible.com, RARIBLE.com. But don't even think about it unless you already are involved in cryptocurrency and you understand how it works. If you don't want to know more about it, by all means, research NFT. Just Google it. What is an NFT? And you'll find a huge amount of information. But don't start investing in NFTs until you have a full understanding of how they work, but also the additional costs involved, because transacting in cryptocurrency is very expensive, aside from the cost of the cryptocurrency itself. So what does this mean for career choices? And these are, of course, the important answers, where the demand is going to be and where the opportunity is. It's a very dense slide, so I'm going to ask you to read it for yourselves, and I'll just highlight the most important points from it. That will be a big demand in certain areas, especially with regard to caring, programming, and consulting. But the opportunity will truly be where you're able to provide specialized services. And in the post-pandemic era, therapists and carers are going to be in even higher demand than ever, from a health and personal care point of view. And then in programming, areas like artificial intelligence, blockchain, and security will be critical. Business consulting will be massive as new industries emerge and new categories of business and new styles and structures of deals and transactions between businesses. So private equity, deal structuring, and financial management are going to be huge growth areas in terms of the specialists that will be needed for the emerging technologies, emerging businesses, and emerging industries. And compliance and business analysis will be critical elements of those. So what this slide really adds up to is that there is a vast range of opportunity, a vast range of careers that is going to be not just opening up, but also expanding over the coming decade. And this really is the counterpoint to artificial intelligence taking away jobs. Artificial intelligence will in fact support many of these careers. So what are the raw skills that will be needed, as opposed to just the qualifications? If you want to work in these industries, in care and therapy, empathy, caring, and consideration will be critical. In programming, problem solving, pattern recognition, creativity. In business consulting, analytical minds, networking skills. And for any startup, you have to have a problem-solving mindset and an entrepreneurial mindset. Many an inventor has failed completely because they thought all they needed was to be able to invent something. They didn't realize they also had to be an entrepreneur. So creativity without entrepreneurialism tends to be merely indulgence. And then if you're looking to what you should be studying, then this is what you need to bear in mind, not as the area of study in terms of your course or your degree, but rather what should form part of your curriculum. It must include an understanding of how artificial intelligence will affect your career and your industry. If a law degree doesn't include an element of AI implications for the law profession, then it's a deficient degree, for example. In the business world, understanding supply and demand and supply chain logistics, as well as consumer behavior, will be critical, especially in the post-pandemic era. And if we ever do have another pandemic, then supply chain logistics will be one of the keys to keeping the world going. Understanding human psychology is critical in terms of coming up with business ideas or marketing those businesses effectively. And then a good command of business language, I cannot overemphasize the importance of. People are unable to communicate their ideas or their business model or the arguments for investment in their business are going to be lagging behind the rest. And both English and Mandarin are going to be critical skills in the coming decade. You don't have to have both, but what an advantage if you do. And finally, this is the key. You have to learn how to learn. These were wonderful words from Gary Marcus, who co-authored a book called Rebooting AI. And he spoke to The Economist 2 years ago, where he made these comments. And he said, creativity, on-the-fly learning, and critical thinking skills are what matters. Your grandchildren may live in a world without work, but you won't. You will live in a world that is rapidly changing. He then goes on to talk about how important it is to learn to code, but he's saying it'll be a valuable skill. It doesn't mean that it's the only skill or that it's an essential skill, but it's going to be exceptionally valuable because knowing the logic of machines is going to be critical. And learning coding also teaches you the logic of machines. So the full circle that this brings us to is the extent to which AutoSA is involved in programs to teach coding. And this sums up why that is not just an indulgence, why it is a critical part of the future. But as important as that is learning how to learn. And you'll keep having to learn and relearn through the 2020s. Thank you very much. Here's some resources that